Hey guys, settle in, dim the lights, and let's get cozy. Tonight we're drifting back to the medieval era, a time when things were, well, a bit odd, even by their own standards. Forget everything you think you know about sensible living, because we're about to explore some traditions that make you wonder if they were just doing it for the giggles. So grab a warm drink, snuggle down, and let's unravel the curious case of medieval normalcy, one baffling custom at a time. It's going to be a long, slow journey, perfect for lulling you into a peaceful slumber. Chapter 1. The most confusing medieval traditions people thought were normal, and more. We begin our gentle descent into the past with a rather peculiar concept, the medieval trial by ordeal. Now, in an age without CSI or even, basic forensic science, how did you figure out if someone was guilty? You certainly couldn't just ask them nicely and expect the truth, so they decided, why not ask God? Or perhaps more accurately, why not make the accused person go through something so utterly ridiculous that God would surely intervene if they were innocent? Because, of course, that's how divine justice works. One of the greatest hits of the trial by ordeal era was the ordeal by hot iron. The accused, poor soul, would have to pick up a red-hot piece of iron and carry it for a certain distance. Sometimes it was just a few steps, sometimes it was 9 feet, because why not add a bit of an Olympic challenge to your divine judgment? After this delightful stroll, their hand would be bandaged, and then, after 3 days, the bandage was removed. If the wound was healing cleanly, hooray! God declared them innocent. If it was festering, well, clearly God had a different opinion. Never mind the obvious medical fact that a third-degree burn is almost certainly going to look pretty nasty after 3 days, regardless of your guilt or innocence. It's almost as if they hadn't quite grasped germ theory yet. Almost. Then there was the equally charming ordeal by water, which came in 2 delightful flavors, hot and cold. For the hot water version, the accused had to plunge their hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Again, if the burn healed well, innocent. If not, guilty. The cold water ordeal was perhaps even more bizarre, if such a thing is possible. The accused, often bound hand and foot, would be thrown into a body of water. If they sank, they were considered innocent, as the pure water would accept them. If they floated, however, they were deemed guilty, because the water was rejecting their sinful presence. So if you were a bit on the buoyant side, you were pretty much out of luck. It's hard to imagine a system more perfectly designed to condemn innocent people who happen to be good swimmers. And let's not forget the less common but equally unhinged ordeal by combat. This one was mostly for the nobility, because apparently God cared more about their jousting skills. If 2 people had a dispute and couldn't resolve it, they'd fight it out. The winner was presumed to be in the right, because God would grant victory to the just party. This, of course, meant that the better fighter, or perhaps just the one having a particularly good day, was automatically correct. Imagine settling a legal dispute by having a boxing match. Actually, don't imagine it too hard. You might give someone ideas. This also led to the rather amusing profession of champion, where you could hire someone to fight on your behalf if you weren't feeling particularly combative yourself, or if you were, say, a woman, a child, or someone elderly. So justice, medieval style, often depended on who had the biggest muscles or the sharpest sword. Very fair, very logical. These trials, while seemingly absurd to us now, were taken with utmost seriousness. People genuinely believed that divine intervention would reveal the truth. It's a testament to the sheer, unshakable faith of the era, or perhaps a testament to the lack of any viable alternative. When you don't have DNA evidence or even reliable eyewitness testimony, you just sort of make things up as you go along. And if God wants to weigh in on who burnt their hand worse, then so be it. Let's gently pivot from the judicial oddities to something a bit more personal. The medieval understanding of medicine was, shall we say, a work in progress, a very slow, often painful, and sometimes fatal work in progress. The prevailing theory was the four humors, derived from ancient Greek medicine. The body was thought to be composed of four primary fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each humor was associated with a specific temperament and element, and illness was believed to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. So, if you had too much blood, you might be sanguine, cheerful, but also prone to fevers. The solution? Bloodletting, of course, because why keep all that pesky blood inside when you could just drain some of it out? This was done via leeches or by making an incision, often by barbers, who were, for some reason, also surgeons. It's a bit like asking your hairdresser to perform open-heart surgery. Seems reasonable, right? Bloodletting was so incredibly popular that it was prescribed for everything from headaches to plague. Feeling a bit under the weather? Bloodletting. Stubbed your toe? Bloodletting. Just a bit peckish? You guessed it, bloodletting. And then there was the idea that illnesses were caused by bad air or miasma. This led to some truly creative solutions, like carrying around posies of sweet-smelling flowers, not because they looked pretty, but because people genuinely thought the scent would ward off disease. So, while lovely, those bouquets weren't doing much against the actual plague. They just made the dying smell a bit nicer, which I suppose is something. Childbirth, as you can imagine, was an incredibly dangerous affair for both the mother and child. Infant mortality rates were astronomically high, and many women died during or shortly after giving birth. They didn't have sterile environments, anesthesia, or even a basic understanding of hygiene. Midwives, often older women with practical experience, were the primary attendants. While some were highly skilled, others not so much. Superstitions abounded, and charms and prayers were often considered as important as any practical aid. One common belief was that difficult labor could be eased by unlocking every lock in the house, or by having someone physically open every door and window, because a bit of fresh air and fewer locked cupboards would surely help with a breech birth, right? It's charming in its naivete, a bit tragic in its ultimate ineffectiveness. Let's float over to another rather delightful and perhaps slightly confusing tradition: sumptuary laws. These were laws designed to regulate consumption and prevent people from dressing above their station, because in a highly stratified society, you wouldn't want a commoner strutting around looking like a noble, would you? That would just confuse everyone and, more importantly, upset the delicate social order.
So these laws dictated what colors, fabrics, and even types of fur people of different social classes could wear. Only royalty could wear certain shades of purple, because purple dye was incredibly expensive, and thus a clear marker of extreme wealth. If you were a merchant, you might be allowed to wear fine wools, but certainly not silk or velvet. And don't even think about wearing ermine or sable if you weren't a duke or higher. It was all about visual cues. You could tell someone's social status just by glancing at their clothes, which in a way made things very clear. No awkward guessing games at medieval parties. Oh, he's wearing linen and no fur. Definitely a peasant, or maybe a very thrifty knight. These laws even extended to food, though less rigorously enforced. The idea was that certain foods were appropriate for certain classes. Game meats, for example, were often reserved for the nobility, who had the right to hunt in their vast forests. Peasants, meanwhile, were mostly stuck with grains, vegetables, and whatever small animals they could catch, without incurring the wrath of their lord. It was all about maintaining the illusion that the social hierarchy was natural and divinely ordained, rather than a system based on who happened to own the most land. The concept of time itself was also a bit different. While they had clocks, particularly in monasteries, most people's lives were governed by the sun, the seasons, and the church bells. The day was divided into canonical hours marked by prayers. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline weren't just religious observances. They structured the day for many, especially those living near a monastery or church. It was a rhythm dictated by faith, a gentle, repetitive beat that shaped existence in a way we can barely imagine today, with our atomic clocks and constant digital notifications. Let's drift on to the rather charming, if a little disturbing, medieval concept of animal trials. Yes, you heard that right. Animals were put on trial for crimes. Pigs, goats, rats, even insects, if they committed an offense, they could be arrested, given a lawyer, and tried in court. Because naturally, a pig that had inadvertently trampled a child was fully aware of the legal implications of its actions. There's a famous case from 1457 in France where a sow and her 6 piglets were put on trial for the murder of a 5-year-old child. The sow was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged. The piglets, however, were acquitted due to their young age and the mitigating circumstance that their mother had led them astray. It's hard to imagine the courtroom proceedings for such an event. The prosecution calls the sow. And then what? Does the pig testify? Does it squeal its innocence? These trials weren't just a quirky local custom. They were formal legal proceedings, complete with legal representation for the accused animals. It reflects a worldview where the line between humans and animals, and even the natural world, was far blurrier than it is today. Animals were seen as moral agents, capable of committing sins and deserving of justice, or at least a very formal condemnation. It's a wonderfully weird little insight into the medieval mind, where every aspect of life, even the actions of a rogue pig, could be imbued with deep moral and spiritual significance. It's a system that truly makes you wonder what kind of legal precedent they were setting. Well, Your Honor, in the case of the rampaging rooster of 1342, the verdict was. Then there's the rather curious phenomenon of saintly relics. In an age of deep faith, tangible connections to saints were highly prized. Churches and monasteries would go to extraordinary lengths to acquire relics, bones, hair, clothing fragments, or even objects supposedly touched by a saint. The more prestigious the saint, the more valuable the relic, and naturally the more fragments of the same saint seemed to exist in different places. You might find the head of St. John the Baptist in one cathedral, an arm in another, and a finger in a third. It's almost as if saints had an infinite number of body parts. This led to some rather unholy competition, and let's be honest, a fair bit of fraud. People would create fake relics, knowing that pilgrims would travel great distances and pay good money to venerate them. It was a thriving industry, driven by faith and a healthy dose of medieval marketing. Imagine a medieval infomercial. Are you suffering from the plague? Do you want better crops? Then you need the genuine finger bone of St. Cuthbert. Act now, supplies are limited. It's a testament to the power of belief, even when that belief was occasionally, shall we say, misplaced. Let's now gently meander towards the lives of royalty, specifically their slightly less than perfect physical attributes, which of course were always subject to flattering portraits, but rarely escaped the observant eye of a chronicler. Take, for instance, Charles II of Spain, known to history as Charles the Bewitched. Now, he wasn't technically medieval, being a late 17th century Habsburg, but his story perfectly encapsulates the culmination of centuries of unfortunate royal breeding decisions. His family tree was less a tree and more a very tightly coiled shrub. His parents were uncle and niece, which by that point in the Habsburg dynasty was practically considered out of breeding. His grandmother was also his aunt, and his great-grandmother was his great-aunt. You get the picture. Charles was born with a large head, a huge tongue that made speaking and eating difficult, and a jaw so pronounced he couldn't close his mouth. He was often sickly, epileptic, and generally described as physically and mentally infirm. He couldn't speak until he was 4, and couldn't walk until he was 8. And yet, this was the King of Spain, one of the most powerful empires in the world. His life was a slow, painful testament to the perils of extreme inbreeding, a gentle, tragic fading out of a once mighty dynasty, not with a bang, but with a very sad, drooling whimper. He was called the Bewitched because people genuinely believed his ailments were due to sorcery, rather than, genetics, because why consider the obvious biological consequences when you can blame a witch? It's a recurring theme in history. Blame the mysterious forces rather than face uncomfortable truths. We can also consider the more subtle but equally debilitating quirks of earlier monarchs. Take Edward II of England, for example. He was supposed to be a warrior king, like his imposing father, Edward I. But Edward II had other interests. He liked swimming, digging ditches, and engaging in rather intense friendships with commoners. This, of course, absolutely horrified the nobility, who expected their king to be out on the battlefield, looking suitably regal and intimidating. Instead, they had a king who seemed more interested in manual labor and spending time with his favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston.
Gaveston, a Gascon knight, was lavished with titles and wealth, and, crucially, treated as a virtual equal by the king. This caused immense resentment among the English barons, who saw Gaveston as an upstart, influencing royal policy. Edward's devotion to Gaveston was so intense that when the barons exiled Gaveston, Edward just brought him back. And then they exiled him again, and Edward brought him back again. It was a cycle of predictable drama that ultimately led to Gaveston's brutal execution by the barons. Edward's personal preferences, his lack of interest in traditional kingship, and his unwavering devotion to a few favorites made him a rather ineffective and ultimately tragic monarch, a gentle drift towards disaster that ultimately cost him his crown and eventually his life. His reign was a quiet, continuous struggle between his personal desires and the expectations of his role, a struggle he consistently lost. Let's not forget the rather unfortunate habits that some royals developed. King Henry VI of England, for instance, was known for his extreme piety and gentle nature, which, while admirable in a monk, was less ideal in a king of England during the Wars of the Roses. He was prone to bouts of mental illness, often lapsing into catatonic states where he would be completely unresponsive. During one such episode, he apparently didn't even recognize his own son, Edward. He was, to put it mildly, not a terribly effective ruler. He preferred to meditate and pray, leaving the messy business of governance to his ambitious and often warring nobles. His personal gentle nature contrasted sharply with the brutal realities of his reign, making him a passive observer in his own downfall. Imagine having a king who occasionally just checked out for months at a time. Not exactly the stability you need when your country is tearing itself apart. His gentle, almost saintly demeanor was completely at odds with the demands of his position, leading to a long, slow decline for both himself and his kingdom. And then there's the delightful world of medieval hygiene, or lack thereof. While some wealthy individuals did bathe, it wasn't exactly a daily ritual for most. Baths were often seen as a luxury, or even, at times, as potentially unhealthy. The prevailing belief was that opening the pores could make one susceptible to disease. So people often just layered on perfumes and sweet-smelling herbs to mask body odor. Imagine the glorious aroma of a medieval court, a heady mix of unwashed bodies, rich food, and whatever flowers they could get their hands on. It's a sensory experience we are probably quite fortunate to have avoided. And let's not even get started on dental hygiene, or the almost complete absence thereof. Teeth were simply expected to decay and fall out, a natural part of life. Toothache was a common affliction, and remedies often involved charming rather than dentistry. It's a stark reminder of how far we've come in simple, everyday comfort and health. Chapter 2. The Art of Royal Incompetence and the Habsburg Jaw. So we find ourselves drifting further into the peculiar world of dynastic biology, specifically the Habsburgs, who really did take the concept of keeping it in the family to a competitive level. While we touched on Charles III, his lineage is a long, slow-motion car crash of genetic choices that were made with the best of intentions, mostly to keep land and gold, but with the worst possible biological outcomes. You see, the Habsburgs were obsessed with their own blood. They believed it was so special that mixing it with anyone else would be a downgrade. The result, unfortunately, was a chin that arrived in the room 5 minutes before the rest of the king did. Take Maximilian I, the man who really kicked off the trend of imperial chin energy.
He was a reasonably capable ruler for the late 1400s, but he possessed that unmistakable protruding lower lip. It wasn't quite the disaster it would become later, but the seeds were sown. By the time we get to his grandson, Charles V, the lip had become a full-blown topographical feature. Charles V was the most powerful man in Europe, ruling over an empire where the sun never set. Yet he literally couldn't chew his food properly because his teeth didn't meet. Imagine being the Holy Roman Emperor, commanding vast Spanish armadas and German legions, and yet being defeated daily by a tough piece of mutton. He often ate alone because the sight of him trying to navigate a meal was, well, less than imperial. He was a man of immense dignity, trapped in a body that was slowly folding in on itself. Let's float over to the Spanish branch of the family, where things got truly specialized. The Spanish Habsburgs were particularly fond of marrying their own nieces. Philip II, Philip III, and Philip IV all participated in this genealogical loop-de-loop. Philip IV, for instance, married Mariana of Austria, who was his sister's daughter. This meant his wife was also his niece, and their children were, well, let's just say the family tree was starting to look more like a telephone pole. Philip IV was a man of refined tastes, a patron of the arts, who loved Velázquez, but he was also remarkably lethargic. He seemed to spend most of his reign in a state of mild, royal confusion, watching his empire slowly crumble while he focused on the precise etiquette of the court. He had a face that seemed perpetually elongated, as if the weight of his own jaw was dragging his features downward. This brings us back to the tragic Charles III, the ultimate product of this purity. By the time Charles was born, his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if his parents had been siblings. He was literally a genetic dead end. The court doctors, in their infinite medieval wisdom, suggested that his problem stemmed from a curse. They even performed exorcisms on him. It's a very human tendency, isn't it, to blame a shadowy supernatural force rather than admit that marrying your niece for the 5th generation in a row might be a bad idea. Charles was gentle, though. He was known to be kind-hearted, even if he couldn't quite grasp the complexities of statecraft or, basic sentences. He spent a lot of time playing with toys and being looked after by his mother, a king who remained a permanent child in a body that was failing him. When he died, his autopsy, which was recorded with a startling lack of bedside manner, claimed his body didn't contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, and his head was full of water. While that's likely a bit of dramatic flair from the 1700s, it paints a vivid picture of a man who was never really meant for this world. But the Habsburgs weren't the only ones with a monopoly of weirdness. Let's drift north to Russia, to the era of the Tsars, where dysfunctional was less of a personality trait than a job requirement. Consider Ivan the Terrible. Now, Ivan started off quite promisingly. He was intelligent, well-read, and reformed the government. But then things took a turn. After the death of his beloved wife, Anastasia, whom he believed was poisoned by the boyars, Ivan's mental health began to gently, then rapidly unravel. He became paranoid, creating the Oprichnia, a personal army of black-clad riders who terrorized the country. They carried severed dogs' heads and brooms on their saddles to sniff out and sweep away treason, because nothing says stable leadership than a dog's head on a horse.
Ivan's most famous moment of tragic instability was, of course, when he killed his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, in a fit of rage. The story goes that the Tsar was annoyed by the way his daughter-in-law was dressed. He struck her, the son intervened, and Ivan hit him over the head with a heavy staff. The image of the aging, horrified Tsar cradling his dying son is one of the most haunting in Russian history. It was a disaster of his own making, a moment of uncontrolled anger that effectively ended his direct line and led Russia toward the time of troubles. Ivan spent his final years in a haze of guilt and superstition, alternating between bouts of extreme violence and deep religious penance. He was a man of extremes, a king who couldn't govern his own emotions, let alone a massive empire. And then there were the sickly and spoiled children of the medieval and Renaissance courts. Being a royal child wasn't all crowns and ponies. It was often a cycle of being overfed, underexercised, and constantly poked by doctors. Take the French Dauphin. The mortality rate for the heirs to the French throne was so high, it's a wonder there was ever a king at all. They were kept in stifling, unventilated rooms to protect them from bad air, which of course just made them more susceptible to respiratory issues. They were swaddled so tightly they could barely move, based on the theory that it would keep their limbs straight. It's almost as if the more care they received, the more likely they were to wither away. One particularly sad case was that of Edward VI of England, the boy king. The son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, Edward was a highly intelligent, intensely Protestant child who became king at age 9. He was kept in a sort of gilded cage, surrounded by tutors and ambitious uncles who fought over his signature. Edward was a bit of a prig, to be honest. He kept a diary where he recorded the execution of his own uncles with a chilling lack of emotion. The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off, he wrote, as if he were noting the weather. But his health was always fragile. He eventually succumbed to a lung infection, likely tuberculosis, at age 15. His death triggered a massive succession crisis, proving that even the most carefully guarded royal life was no match for a common germ. Let's glide over to the French court of the late 1700s just for a moment to look at the sheer, bored decadence of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Now, Louis wasn't a bad man, he was just a very quiet man who would have been much happier as a locksmith. He had a workshop in Versailles where he spent hours tinkering with locks and keys. It was a meditative, solitary hobby that allowed him to ignore the fact that his country was literally bankrupt and starving. There's something almost sweet about a king who just wants to make sure a latch clicks perfectly while the Bastille is being scouted for a revolution. He was indecisive, prone to following the last person who spoke to him, and lived in a perpetual state of, I'd rather be doing literally anything else. Marie Antoinette, however, was bored in a much more expensive way. Contrary to popular belief, she probably never said, "let them eat cake," but she did spend a fortune on a miniature peasant village called the Hameau de la Reine. Here, she and her ladies-in-waiting would dress up as milkmaids and shepherdesses and pretend to live a simple life. They had clean cows that were washed before the queen arrived, and they milked them into porcelain buckets. It was the 18th century equivalent of a billionaire going glamping. This performative poverty was, understandably, not a great look while the actual peasants were eating grass to survive. It was a bubble of pure, unadulterated delusion, a slow-moving parade of silk and powdered hair toward a very sharp, very public end. Speaking of delusions, we can't ignore the Glass King, Charles VI of France. Charles started his reign well enough, earning the nickname the Beloved. But then, one day while riding through a forest, he had a sudden psychotic break and attacked his own knights. From then on, his mind was a fractured thing. He would often forget who he was, or even that he was married. Most famously, he went through a period where he believed he was made of glass. He had special clothes made with iron ribs to prevent himself from shattering, and he refused to let anyone touch him for fear of breaking into 1,000 pieces. He would spend months refusing to wash or change his clothes, roaming the halls of his palace like a ghost. His court was left in a state of permanent confusion, with various factions trying to rule in the name of a king who thought he was a window pane. It's these personal, fragile moments that really remind us how strange history is. We think of kings as these grand marble statues, but they were often just people with very specific, very odd problems, amplified by the fact that no one was allowed to tell them no. It was a world where a king's mental health could determine the fate of millions, and yet the only treatment available was a prayer, a leech, or a new suit of iron-ribbed underwear. Chapter 3. The Marital Carousel of Genetic Doom. We drift now into the realm of the royal wedding,
an event that we now view as a fairy tale, but in the Middle Ages was more like a high-stakes game of real estate acquisition, just with more lace and significantly more cousin marrying. You see, the primary goal of a royal marriage wasn't love, perish the thought. It was the union of crowns. If you could marry a woman who owned a province, you didn't have to go to the trouble of invading it. It was much more efficient, though the long-term biological costs were, shall we say, a bit steep. Take, for example, the marriage of Joanna of Castile and Philip the Handsome. Now, Philip was a Habsburg, and as we've discussed, handsome was a relative term, usually bestowed by people who wanted to keep their heads. Joanna, however, genuinely adored him. She was so intensely devoted to him that when he died quite suddenly after drinking cold water after a game of ball, because apparently cold water was a lethal weapon in 1506, Joanna simply refused to let him go. She had his body embalmed and traveled across Spain with his coffin in a slow, mournful procession that lasted for years. She would occasionally open the casket to check on him, just to make sure he was still there, which is a level of commitment most of us can barely fathom. She became known as Joanna the Mad, but one has to wonder if she was just a woman who had finally snapped under the pressure of being a political pawn in a family that viewed her mainly as a walking womb for more Habsburgs.
Then we have the unfortunate case of Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII. Henry, who was by this point becoming less of a dashing prince and more of a grumpy, mobile mountain, decided he needed a fourth wife based on a portrait painted by Hans Holbein. When Anne arrived, Henry was reportedly horrified. He claimed she looked like a Flanders mare, which was a bit rich coming from a man who had to be hoisted onto his horse with a winch. The marriage was never consummated because Henry was too disappointed by her physical appearance, or perhaps he just couldn't find his own feet under his stomach. They divorced almost immediately, but Anne was the real winner here. She stayed in England, kept her head, was given several palaces, and became the king's beloved sister. She spent the rest of her life drinking beer and playing cards, which, considering what happened to Henry's other wives, was basically winning the Tudor lottery. Let's float over to the concept of the proxy marriage. This was a delightful tradition where two people would be legally married without actually being in the same country. A representative for the groom would stand in, and to symbolize the consummation of the marriage, the representative would put his bare leg into the bride's bed. It was all very formal, very legal, and incredibly awkward. Imagine being a young princess, being told you're now married to a man you've never met because a stranger put his calf on your mattress. It's the kind of logic that only makes sense if you're trying to secure a border in the Pyrenees. These marriages often resulted in children who were essentially biological experiments. We've talked about the Habsburg jaw, but the physical toll was everywhere. We see royal children who were born with rickets, scurvy, and various feeblenesses that were attributed to the sins of the father or the humors of the mother, but were actually just the result of a very small, very stagnant dating pool. There's a certain irony in the fact that the people who believed they had the purest blood were actually the ones most likely to be suffering from hemophilia or physical deformities. They were so afraid of diluting their power that they ended up concentrating their weaknesses. Consider the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King. He turned the act of waking up into a theatrical performance. This was the levee, where the highest-ranking nobles in France would compete for the honor of holding the king's shirt or handing him his breeches. If you were lucky, you might get to hold the candle while the king went to the bathroom. It was a system of absolute power built on absolute absurdity. By making the nobility obsess over who got to hand him his socks, Louis ensured they were too busy to start a civil war. It was brilliant in a very petty, powdered wig sort of way. But it also meant the king was never alone. Every physical function, every private moment was a public event. Even the birth of royal children was a spectator sport, with dozens of courtiers crowding into the bedroom to ensure the baby wasn't swapped for a peasant's child in a warming pan. It's a strange, slow existence lived under a microscope,
A world where your wedding is a treaty, your body is state property, and your only escape is a workshop where you make locks or a fake village where you pretend to be a milkmaid. It's a tragedy wrapped in silk and hidden behind a very large, very unfortunate jaw. Let's drift toward the peculiar medieval obsession with bezoar stones. These were stony concretions found in the stomachs of goats and other ruminants. They were considered the ultimate antidote to poison. Every paranoid royal, which was basically all of them, had a bezoar stone nearby. They would dip it into their wine to neutralize any toxins. There's a story of a doctor who wanted to prove to King Charles IX of France that the stone was a fraud. He took a condemned prisoner who had been poisoned and gave him the bezoar. The prisoner died in agony, proving the doctor right, but the kings kept using them anyway, because when you live in a world where your own brother might put arsenic in your pottage, a goat's stomach stone provides a very necessary, if entirely imaginary, sense of security. It's a world where the cure was often more terrifying than the disease, a place where a monarch could survive a war, an assassination attempt, and a coup, only to be taken down by a doctor with a bowl of leeches and a misunderstood textbook. It's a slow, rhythmic cycle of suffering, hidden behind the velvet curtains of the palace, where the air was thick with the scent of burnt herbs and the quiet, desperate prayers of a court that didn't want to be the next ones in the coronation chair. Chapter 5. The Royal Table and the Gastronomic Path to an Early Grave. We drift now into the Great Hall, where the air is thick with the scent of roasted peacock, heavy spices, and a general disregard for anything resembling a vegetable. For the medieval and Renaissance elite, food was not just sustenance, it was an aggressive display of wealth and power. If you were a king, you didn't eat to live, you ate to show everyone else that you could afford to eat everything. This led to a diet that was essentially a slow-motion assault on the gallbladder. Consider the four-legged disaster that was the typical royal feast. A high-ranking noble might be served dozens of courses, featuring animals that we wouldn't dream of eating today. Swans, herons, and even dolphins were on the menu. But the real star of the show was meat, and lots of it. Vegetables were viewed with deep suspicion, seeing as the food of peasants who were close to the dirt. A king eating a salad would be like a modern billionaire driving a rusted bicycle. It just didn't fit the brand. This meant that the royal digestive system was a permanent war zone of protein and fat, with very little fiber to keep the peace. Take King Henry VIII, our favorite cautionary tale of royal excess. In his youth, Henry was a champion athlete, but as he aged, he leaned into his role as a professional eater. A typical day for Henry might involve several pounds of beef, mutton, veal, and pork, all washed down with gallons of ale and wine. Because the water was often questionable, wine was the safer bet, which is a wonderful excuse for being perpetually tipsy by noon. By the end of his life, Henry's waistline was so vast that he had to be moved from room to room using a series of pulleys and a specially designed going chair. He was a man literally consumed by his own consumption. His legs were covered in chronic weeping ulcers, likely a combination of type 2 diabetes and scurvy, because, of course, why eat a lemon when you can have another leg of lamb? Then there was the sugar subtlety. In the late medieval period, sugar was an incredibly expensive luxury imported from the East. To show off, royal pastry chefs would create subtleties, elaborate sculptures made of sugar paste. They would build entire castles, scenes of St. George slaying the dragon, or even working clocks, all made of sugar, and the royals would eat them. Queen Elizabeth I of England was particularly fond of sweets. She ate so much sugar that by her 60s, her teeth were famously black. When foreign ambassadors visited, they noted that her speech was sometimes difficult to understand because of the missing or blackened state of her mouth. She didn't mind, though, Black teeth became a bit of a fashion statement in her court. It showed you were wealthy enough to afford the sugar that rotted them. It's the ultimate weird flex, having a mouth like a burnt-out fireplace just to prove you're rich. Let's float over to the tragic end of King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, who truly died for his craft. In 1771, the king sat down for a meal that would go down in history as the ultimate overindulgence. He consumed a feast of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the dessert. He ate 14 servings of hetvägg, a traditional Swedish pastry filled with almond paste and served in a bowl of hot milk. He ate so many that his digestive system simply gave up. He died later that night of digestive problems. He's remembered in Sweden as the king who ate himself to death. There's a certain tragic irony in a man who survived the complex politics of the 18th century only to be defeated by a sweet bun and a splash of warm milk. And we must mention the taster, the most stressful job in the palace. Every bite a king took had to be sampled first by a servant to ensure it wasn't poisoned. This meant the king's food was almost always cold by the time it reached him. Imagine being the most powerful person in the land and never, ever getting a hot meal. It's a small, chilly price to pay for not being assassinated by your brother-in-law, I suppose. The taster would have to wait a certain amount of time after eating to see if they dropped dead. If they remained upright, the king would dig in. It was a slow, nervous ritual that turned every dinner into a life-and-death gamble. This world of heavy meats, blackened teeth, and cold, sampled stews paints a picture of a life that was opulent but deeply uncomfortable. It was a gilded existence where your own fork was a potential weapon and your favorite dessert could be your downfall. It's a reminder that even the grandest life was lived on the edge of a very precarious, very poorly balanced humor. Chapter 6: The Menagerie of the Narcissistic and the Royal Furry Favorites. We drift now into the drafty corridors, where the sound of heavy silk is often accompanied by the pitter-patter of paws and the screech of exotic birds. In an age where most of the population viewed animals as either transportation or dinner, the elite looked at them as something else entirely, a way to show off just how far their reach extended across the globe. If you were a king and you didn't have an animal that could potentially eat your courtiers, were you even really trying?
Consider the Tower of London. Long before it was a grim prison, it was a royal menagerie. Starting back with King John and expanding under Henry III, the tower became a collection of diplomatic gifts that must have been a nightmare for the royal keepers. Henry III was gifted 3 leopards by the Holy Roman Emperor, a nod to the English royal coat of arms. But the real star was the polar bear, a gift from the King of Norway. Now, the English didn't exactly have a manual on how to care for an Arctic predator in a temperate climate. Their solution was remarkably simple. They tied a long rope around the bear's neck and let it swim in the Thames to catch its own fish. Imagine being a medieval fisherman, minding your own business in a small rowboat, and seeing a massive white bear surfacing next to you. It's the kind of thing that makes you rethink your career choices. Then there was the African elephant, a gift from Louis IX of France. This poor creature was the first of its kind seen in England, and the chroniclers were baffled by it. They didn't know what it ate, so they reportedly gave it beef and ale. Surprisingly, the elephant did not thrive on a diet of pub food and died shortly after. It was a pattern that repeated itself throughout history. Kings collecting animals like living stamps, with very little regard for the actual biology of the creatures involved. Let's float over to the more domestic side of royal animal obsession. King Charles II, who we've already established was quite the character, was famously obsessed with his spaniels. He had dozens of them, and they were allowed to roam freely throughout Whitehall Palace. They slept in his bed, they sat on his lap during meetings of the Privy Council, and they generally made the palace smell like a wet dog.
The king was so devoted to them that he was often accused of playing with his dogs while his ministers were trying to discuss the Dutch war. He even issued a royal decree that these spaniels could not be barred from any public place, including the Houses of Parliament. It was a level of canine privilege that hasn't been seen since. One courtier grumbled that the king's dogs made the entire court stink of the kennel. But when you're the king, if you want your palace to smell like a golden retriever's ear, that's exactly what it's going to smell like. Moving to the French court, we find Henri III, a man who took toy dogs to a whole new level. Henri was a complicated king, highly intelligent but prone to deep bouts of melancholy. To cheer himself up, he would carry a small basket around his neck, lined with silk, containing several tiny papillon dogs. He would walk through the halls of the Louvre, surrounded by his mignons, his handsome young favorites, while cradling a basket of puppies. He reportedly spent hundreds of thousands of livres on their collars and upkeep, even as his kingdom was being torn apart by the wars of religion. There is something deeply ironic about a king trying to maintain the dignity of the French throne while essentially wearing a puppy-carrying necklace. And we can't forget the more tragic animals of history. Take the pet monkey of Princess Charlotte of Prussia. This monkey was dressed in tiny human clothes and taught to sit at the table. One day, the monkey became agitated and bit the princess. The reaction wasn't to discipline the monkey, but to blame the courtier who had introduced them. Or consider the royal cats of the ancient world that survived into the medieval courts as symbols of status. If you killed a royal cat, even by accident, the legal penalties were often more severe than if you had harmed a peasant. The royal menagerie was a microcosm of the royal court itself. Beautiful, expensive, wildly out of place, and usually suffering from a very poor diet. These animals were living symbols of a king's power over nature, but more often than not, they were just another way for a bored monarch to distract themselves from the crushing weight of their own crown. It was a world where a bear had a better health plan than a farmer, provided the bear liked swimming in the Thames. Chapter 7. The Groom of the Stool and the Intimacies of Absolute Power. We float now into the most private and perhaps most bafflingly prestigious corner of the royal household. In the modern world, we value our privacy above almost all else, especially when it comes to the bathroom. But in the Tudor and Stuart courts, privacy was a sign of low status. If you were important, people watched you do everything, and I mean everything. This brings us to the office of the Groom of the Stool. It sounds like a title from a fantasy novel, but it was a very real one, very coveted position. The groom was the official responsible for assisting the king in his daily evacuations. Now, you might think this sounds like the worst job in history, but it was actually the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme. Because the groom spent so much time with the king in his most vulnerable moments, he became the king's closest confidant. While the king was sitting on his close stool, a velvet-lined wooden box with a pewter pot inside, the groom was right there, chatting about policy, gossip, or who was currently annoying the monarch. He was the gatekeeper to the king's ear. If you wanted a favor, you didn't go to the prime minister, you tipped the guy who held the king's toilet paper. It's a perfect example of how power in the medieval and Renaissance world was entirely physical. To be close to the royal body was to be powerful, no matter what part of the body you were tending to. Sir Henry Norris, one of Henry VIII's grooms, was so influential that he was essentially the king's best friend. Of course, being that close to a temperamental man like Henry was a double-edged sword. Norris eventually lost his head because he was accused of being too close to Anne Boleyn. It's a bit of a career hazard when your job description involves knowing all the king's secrets and then being suspected of keeping some of your own. By the time of the Stuarts, the role had become so prestigious that it was held by high-ranking earls. They weren't actually doing the cleaning anymore, they had servants for that, but they kept the title because it meant they were the only ones allowed to be in the room. It was the most exclusive club in England, and the membership fee was a very high tolerance for awkward silences and pewter pots.
Let's drift over to the general state of palace cleanliness, which was, to put it mildly, a struggle. Versailles, the crowning jewel of French architecture, was famously pungent. Because Louis XIV had forgotten to include enough bathrooms for his thousands of courtiers, people often just used the hallways, or behind a curtain, or in a quiet corner of the gardens. The smell was so pervasive that visitors often remarked on it before they even saw the palace. To combat this, the nobility didn't wash. They just added more layers of aqua de violette, or musk. They carried pomanders, perforated metal balls filled with spices to hold to their noses when the scent of 100 unwashed dukes became too much to bear. The king himself was not exempt from this fear of water. Louis XIV is said to have only taken 2 full baths in his entire adult life, on the advice of his doctors, who thought water weakened the skin's defenses. Instead, he was rubbed down with spirits and changed his linen shirt several times a day. The theory was that the linen would wick away the impurities from the skin. So the king felt clean because his shirt was white, even if his body hadn't seen a loofah since the 1660s. It's a world where cleanliness was an optical illusion, a performance of fresh fabric, hiding a very ancient, very royal layer of grime. Then we have the great bed of ware and other communal sleeping arrangements. In many royal households, the king didn't sleep alone, not just with a spouse, but with his bodyguards, his favorites, and sometimes even random courtiers sleeping on pallets at the foot of his bed. The royal bedchamber was a bustling hub of activity. Even the act of the king going to sleep was a ceremony called the coucher. People would watch him take off his boots, put on his nightcap, and climb into bed. It was a life lived in a fishbowl, where the only way to get a moment of peace was to pretend to be dead, and even then they'd probably perform an autopsy in front of a crowd. It's a strange, slow existence where the most intimate acts are public spectacles and the most disgusting jobs are the most sought after. It reminds us that dignity is a very flexible concept. A king could be the most powerful man on earth, but he still needed someone to help him with his breeches and a heavy dose of perfume to hide the fact that the Sun King hadn't showered in a decade. Chapter 8. Sad, Sickly, and Spoiled. The Gilded Misery of Royal Childhood. We drift now into the nursery, which in a medieval palace was less a place of play and more a high-security holding cell for the future of the state. Being born a royal child was a bit of a genetic lottery, where the prize was a crown, but the entry fee was a high probability of not making it to your 10th birthday. If you were a prince or princess, you weren't really a person. You were a walking treaty, a tiny swaddled insurance policy against civil war. Because of this, the level of protection these children received was often what ended up making them so incredibly sickly. Take the practice of swaddling, for instance. It was believed that if you didn't wrap a baby tightly enough to resemble a silk-covered burrito, their limbs would grow crooked, or heaven forbid, they might crawl around like an animal. So royal infants spent their first months of life virtually immobilized. They were pinned down in layers of linen and brocade, often left in unventilated rooms because fresh air was considered thin and dangerous. It's a bit of a miracle any of them developed the muscle tone to eventually walk, let alone lead an army. And then there was the diet. While peasant children were likely getting at least some nutrients from coarse grains and the occasional vegetable, royal children were often overfed on refined foods. We're talking about mushed-up white bread, heavy creams, and sugared wines. They were essentially being primed for gout before they could even spell it. Because they were so valuable, they were often kept indoors, away from the sun and the dirt, which meant rickets was a frequent visitor to the royal nursery. You had these pale, spindly-legged children stumbling through the halls of magnificent palaces, their bones literally softening because their parents were too afraid to let them play in the grass. It's a world where cleanliness was an optical illusion, a performance of fresh fabric hiding a very ancient, very royal layer of grime.
Then we have the great bed of ware and other communal sleeping arrangements. In many royal households, the king didn't sleep alone, not just with a spouse, but with his bodyguards, his favorites, and sometimes even random courtiers sleeping on pallets at the foot of his bed. The royal bedchamber was a bustling hub of activity. Even the act of the king going to sleep was a ceremony called the coucher. People would watch him take off his boots, put on his nightcap, and climb into bed. It was a life lived in a fishbowl, where the only way to get a moment of peace was to pretend to be dead, and even then they'd probably perform an autopsy in front of a crowd. It's a strange, slow existence where the most intimate acts are public spectacles, and the most disgusting jobs are the most sought after. It reminds us that dignity is a very flexible concept. A king could be the most powerful man on earth, but he still needed someone to help him with his breeches and a heavy dose of perfume to hide the fact that the Sun King hadn't showered in a decade. Chapter 8. Sad, Sickly, and Spoiled. The Gilded Misery of Royal Childhood. We drift now into the nursery, which in a medieval palace was less a place of play and more a high-security holding cell for the future of the state. Being born a royal child was a bit of a genetic lottery, where the prize was a crown, but the entry fee was a high probability of not making it to your 10th birthday. If you were a prince or princess, you weren't really a person. You were a walking treaty, a tiny swaddled insurance policy against civil war. Because of this, the level of protection these children received was often what ended up making them so incredibly sickly. Take the practice of swaddling, for instance. It was believed that if you didn't wrap a baby tightly enough to resemble a silk-covered burrito, their limbs would grow crooked, or heaven forbid, they might crawl around like an animal. So royal infants spent their first months of life virtually immobilized. They were pinned down in layers of linen and brocade, often left in unventilated rooms because fresh air was considered thin and dangerous. It's a bit of a miracle any of them developed the muscle tone to eventually walk, let alone lead an army. And then there was the diet. While peasant children were likely getting at least some nutrients from coarse grains and the occasional vegetable, royal children were often overfed on refined foods. We're talking about mushed-up white bread, heavy creams, and sugared wines. They were essentially being primed for gout before they could even spell it. Because they were so valuable, they were often kept indoors, away from the sun and the dirt, which meant rickets was a frequent visitor to the royal nursery. You had these pale, spindly-legged children stumbling through the halls of magnificent palaces, their bones literally softening because their parents were too afraid to let them play in the grass. It's a world where cleanliness was an optical illusion, a performance of fresh fabric hiding a very ancient, very royal layer of grime. Then we have the great bed of ware and other communal sleeping arrangements. In many royal households, the king didn't sleep alone, not just with his spouse, but with his bodyguards, his favorites, and sometimes even random courtiers sleeping on pallets at the foot of his bed. The royal bedchamber was a bustling hub of activity. Even the act of the king going to sleep was a ceremony called the coucher. People would watch him take off his boots, put on his nightcap, and climb into bed. It was a life lived in a fishbowl, where the only way to get a moment of peace was to pretend to be dead, and even then they'd probably perform an autopsy in front of a crowd. It's a strange, slow existence where the most intimate acts are public spectacles, and the most disgusting jobs are the most sought after. It reminds us that dignity is a very flexible concept. A king could be the most powerful man on earth, but he still needed someone to help him with his breeches and a heavy dose of perfume to hide the fact that the Sun King hadn't showered in a decade.
Chapter 9. The Eternal Performance, Funerals, and the Post-Mortem Paradox. We drift now into the quiet, echoing cathedrals, where the story of a royal life doesn't actually end with their last breath. In fact, for many monarchs, death was just the beginning of their most elaborate public appearance. You see, a king's body was never just a body. It was a symbol of the state's continuity. "The king is dead, long live the king" wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was a legal necessity.
But what do you do with the physical remains when the divine soul has departed and you have a 3-week procession to plan in the middle of a humid July? The answer, as with most things medieval, was complicated, slightly gruesome, and involved a lot of salt. To keep a royal corpse presentable for the weeks of lying in state, the internal organs were often removed, a process known as evisceration. But they didn't just throw them away. That would be wasteful. Instead, they practiced dilaceratio corporis, or the division of the body. The heart might be sent to one favorite abbey, the entrails to a local church, and the rest of the body to the royal mausoleum. It was a way of being in 3 places at once, a final act of multitasking that turned the monarch into a liturgical scavenger hunt. Take the case of Richard the Lionheart. He was a man of such international presence that he decided his body should be shared around. His brain and internal organs were buried where he died in Chaillot. His heart was sent to Rouen in Normandy because he loved the Normans, and the rest of him went to Fontevraud to rest with his father. It's a very literal way of leaving your heart somewhere. Of course, this meant that for centuries, monks in different parts of Europe were all claiming to have a piece of the king, leading to a sort of competitive holy relic economy centered on royal leftovers. Then there's the matter of the funeral effigy. Because an actual corpse, even an eviscerated and salted one, tends to lose its regal charm after a few weeks, the English and French royals started using wax or wooden mannequins. These effigies were dressed in the king's actual robes, wearing his actual crown, and placed on top of the coffin. They were eerily lifelike, with glass eyes and painted skin. During the funeral procession, it looked as though the king was simply taking a very stiff, very vertical nap on top of his own box. People would bow to the wax dummy as it passed, treating the piece of wood with more reverence than they probably showed the man when he was alive. In the basement of Westminster Abbey, you can still see some of these ragged regiment effigies today. Edward III looking a bit dusty, and Queen Elizabeth I staring blankly into the dark. Let's float over to the sheer exhausting scale of these events. When a monarch died, the entire country was expected to stop and mourn, often for months. Everyone at court had to wear mourning black, which was an enormous expense. If you were a minor noble and the king died, you might go bankrupt just trying to buy enough black velvet to show you were sufficiently sad. The processions could stretch for miles, with hundreds of poor men paid to carry torches and chant prayers. It was a slow, flickering river of fire and grief moving across the landscape. And we must mention the tomb effigies, the stone versions that were meant to last forever. These often depicted the king and queen in their prime, looking serene and incredibly healthy. It was the medieval version of a permanent Instagram filter. You could have lived a life of gout, smallpox, and unfortunate jawlines, but your tomb would show you as a chiseled, symmetrical hero of the faith. Some tombs even featured transi or cadaver monuments. These were 2-story affairs. On the top level, the king was shown in his coronation robes. On the bottom level, he was depicted as a rotting skeleton. It was a gentle stone reminder that even if you owned half of France, the worms were still going to get their invite to dinner. There's a strange, quiet irony in the fact that these people, who spent their lives surrounded by crowds and ceremony, were denied privacy even in the grave. Their tombs were opened by curious successors, their bones were moved during revolutions, and their hearts were occasionally stolen by souvenir hunters. During the French Revolution, the royal tombs at Saint-Denis were famously ransacked. The bodies of decades of French kings were tossed into a common pit. It's said that someone even stole the mummified heart of Louis XIV, and in a moment of truly bizarre Victorian eccentricity, it allegedly ended up being accidentally eaten by a geologist named William Buckland. It's a world where death was a stage and the body was a prop, a slow, somber parade of wax, wood, and stone, designed to convince the world that while the man might be gone, the crown was eternal. It was the final, most expensive delusion of the elite, the idea that you could negotiate with the end if you just had enough velvet and a high enough tomb. Chapter 10. The Royal Mistress and the Governance of the Heart. We glide now into the moonlit gardens of the palace, where the formal rigidity of the court gives way to a much more fluid and often much more powerful arrangement. In the world of medieval and Renaissance royalty, the queen was a political necessity, a figure chosen for her dowry, her father's army, or her ability to bridge a border. But the official maîtresse en titre, the official mistress, was often the person the king actually wanted to talk to. It was a position that was quite strangely almost as formal as any office of state. To be the king's favorite wasn't just about romance, it was about being the ultimate lobbyist in an era before lobbyists had offices. In the French court, particularly under the Bourbons, the official mistress had her own apartments, her own budget, and her own set of courtiers who realized that if they wanted a favor from the king, it was much faster to go through the lady with the nice perfume than the minister with the heavy ledger. Take, for instance, Madame de Pompadour. She wasn't just a lover to Louis XV. She was his primary advisor, his artistic director, and his emotional anchor. She was a woman of immense intellect in a world that didn't quite know what to do with a smart woman unless she was behind a curtain. She patronized the arts, influenced foreign policy, and essentially ran the show while Louis indulged in his bouts of melancholy and his peculiar hobby of making his own coffee.
But being the favorite was a precarious business. It was a life lived on a knife edge of royal whim. One day you're receiving diamonds and the finest silks, and the next, the king has a sudden religious epiphany or notices a younger lady in waiting and you're being escorted to a convent. It was a competitive sport where the other women of the court were constantly watching for a single wrinkle or lapse in wit. The stress must have been exhausting. Imagine having to be the most charming, most beautiful, and most politically savvy person in the room every single day just to keep your apartment. Let's float over to England and the court of Charles II, the king who seemed to view the production of illegitimate children as a vital national service. Charles had a wide and varied taste in mistresses, ranging from the aristocratic Barbara Palmer to the orange seller turned actress Nell Gwynn. Nell was the people's mistress. She was funny, brassy, and famously called herself the Protestant mistress to distinguish herself from her Catholic rival, Louise de Querouaille. Nell represents a rare moment where the rigid social hierarchy of the palace was punctured by a bit of genuine vulgar humor. When a mob once surrounded her carriage, thinking it was the unpopular Louise, Nell stuck her head out and shouted, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore." The crowd cheered, and she went on her way. But there was a dark side to this arrangement. The queens, of course, were often left in a perpetual, dignified humiliation. Catherine of Braganza, Charles II's wife, had to endure his mistresses being appointed as her own ladies of the bedchamber. Imagine having to spend your day being waited on by the woman who is currently occupying your husband's affections. It was a system of refined cruelty, wrapped in the etiquette of the day. The queens often turned to deep piety or the quiet company of their own small circles, living as shadows in their own palaces while the favorites glittered in the spotlight. The children born of these unions, the royal bastards, presented their own set of problems. They couldn't inherit the throne, but they were still of royal blood, which made them both dangerous and useful. Kings would often load them with titles and marry them off into the high nobility to create a network of loyal, related families. This is why half the English dukedoms today can trace their lineage back to Charles II's late-night wanderings. It was a way of expanding the royal reach, a shadow dynasty that lived alongside the official one,
forever a reminder that the king's heart rarely followed the path set by his lawyers. It was a world of whispered conversations in alcoves and letters hidden in fans, a world where power was brokered in the bedroom as much as the council chamber. It's a gentle, ironic reminder that even for those who wore the crown, the most complicated battles weren't fought on the field of Agincourt, but in the quiet, candlelit spaces where they tried to find a bit of human connection in a life made of cold marble and public duty. Chapter 11, The Royal Progress and the Logistical Nightmare of Moving a Throne. We drift now out of the stationary grandeur of the palace and onto the muddy, rutted roads of the countryside. You see, a medieval or Renaissance king couldn't just sit in one place for too long. If you stayed in London or Paris forever, the people in the provinces might forget you existed, or worse, they might stop paying their taxes. So the court went on progress. On paper, it was a majestic tour of the realm. In reality, it was a slow-motion natural disaster involving thousands of people, carts, and a very grumpy monarch. Imagine the sheer scale of the undertaking. When Queen Elizabeth I decided to visit her subjects, she didn't just pack a suitcase, she moved her entire government. This included the Privy Council, the royal wardrobe, the laundry, the kitchens, and of course, the groom of the stool and his pewter pots. We are talking about hundreds of carts pulled by oxen, stretching for miles. They had to carry everything because, frankly, the country manors they were visiting weren't equipped to feed 300 starving courtiers at the moment's notice. It was like a giant velvet-clad locust swarm descending on the English countryside. The logistics of the royal progress were enough to give a modern event planner a nervous breakdown. Every night, this massive caravan had to find a place to sleep. If you were a nobleman and you heard the Queen was coming to stay, you didn't celebrate. You checked your bank account and wept. A royal visit could, and often did, bankrupt a family. You had to provide food, wine, entertainment, and gifts for everyone. You might even have to renovate your entire house just to ensure the Queen's bedroom was suitably grand. There's a story of one nobleman who, upon hearing the king was planning a return visit the following year, actually burned his own house down. It was cheaper to start over from scratch than to host the court again. Let's float over to the actual experience of traveling. These weren't paved highways. These were dirt tracks that turned into soup at the first sign of rain. The heavy baggage wagons would get stuck, the oxen would collapse, and the courtiers, dressed in their finest silks and satins, would end up covered in muck. It was a miserable, slow, and incredibly smelly ordeal. Because they were moving so slowly, the bad air and the refuse of thousands of people followed them like a shadow. By the time the progress reached its destination, the court was often exhausted, irritable, and in desperate need of a bath they wouldn't take. And why did they do it? Partly for PR, yes, but also for hygiene. One of the main reasons the court moved was because the palaces themselves became uninhabitable. Without modern plumbing, a palace like Whitehall or the Louvre became a literal cesspool after a few months of housing thousands of people. The progress allowed the palace staff to stay behind, scrub the floors, empty the vats, and let the buildings air out for a season. So the king wasn't just visiting his people, he was fleeing his own plumbing. There is something deeply ironic about the image of a divinely appointed monarch, supposed ruler of the earth and sea, being held up for 3 hours because a wagon full of royal napkins got stuck in a ditch outside of Coventry. It was a world where majesty was constantly being undermined by the reality of mud, and where a king's power was measured by how many oxen it took to move his bed. It was a slow, rhythmic journey through the heart of the kingdom, a parade of power that was simultaneously magnificent and utterly ridiculous. A world of golden coaches and muddy boots, where the glory of the crown was always just one rainstorm away from a very damp, very expensive disaster.
Chapter 12, Stars, Shadows, and the Royal Astrologer's Grip. We drift now into the highest turrets of the palace,
away from the smell of the kitchens and the mud of the road, into the quiet, candlelit rooms of the court astrologers. In the medieval and Renaissance mind, the boundary between science, religion, and what we would now call the occult was incredibly thin. If God had created the stars, then surely he had written the future in them, right? It was only logical. Because of this, no self-respecting monarch would dream of making a major decision, declaring war, signing a treaty, or even getting married, without first consulting their resident stargazer. Take Queen Elizabeth I and her relationship with the famous John Dee. Dee was a brilliant mathematician, a geographer, and a man who claimed he could talk to angels through a crystal ball. When Elizabeth was to be crowned, she didn't just pick a Tuesday because it was convenient. She had Dee calculate the most astrologically favorable date and time for her coronation. He essentially acted as a cosmic GPS for her reign. It's a bit of a funny image, really. A woman known for her iron will, waiting for a man in a pointy hat to tell her if Jupiter was in the right mood for her to wear a crown. But this obsession with the supernatural often took a darker, more paranoid turn. Consider the court of Catherine de' Medici in France. Catherine was famously superstitious, never traveling without her personal astrologer, Cosimo Ruggeri. She was obsessed with prophecies, particularly those of Nostradamus. Legend says he showed her the future of her sons in a magic mirror, where they each circled a room a certain number of times to represent the years of their reign. Can you imagine the sheer, quiet horror of being a mother and watching a mirror tell you exactly how long you have left with your children? It turned the French court into a place of heavy drapes, hushed whispers, and a constant fear of omens. If a bird flew the wrong way over the Louvre, the entire government might grind to a halt. Then there was the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who took royal eccentricity to its absolute peak. Rudolph moved his entire court to Prague and essentially turned his palace into a giant laboratory for alchemists and astronomers. He was less interested in ruling his empire and more interested in finding the philosopher's stone that could turn lead into gold. He spent his days surrounded by dusty manuscripts and cabinets of curiosities filled with things like unicorn horns, probably narwhal tusks, and basilisks, probably dried-out rays. While his empire drifted toward the chaos of the 30 Years' War, Rudolph was busy trying to decode the language of the universe. He was a man who preferred the company of stars and skeletons to that of his own ministers, a gentle, scholarly drift into madness fueled by the desire to know the unknowable. These superstitions weren't just personal quirks, they were tools of statecraft. If a king wanted to get rid of a rival, he didn't always need a sword. Sometimes he just needed an astrologer to discover that the rival was born under a cursed star. It was a world where a solar eclipse wasn't a celestial event to be photographed, but a terrifying sign of divine displeasure that could trigger a national panic. People lived in a state of constant low-level anxiety, looking for patterns in the tea leaves, the stars, or the flight of crows. It's a strange, slow world where the most powerful people on Earth felt completely helpless against the whims of the planets. A world where the Sun King might be afraid of a comet, and where the fate of millions could depend on a man in a tower reading the entrails of a goat or the alignment of Mars. It reminds us that for all their gold and velvet, these monarchs lived in a universe they found deeply frightening and completely unpredictable. Chapter 13: The High Cost of Looking Good and the Architecture of the Silhouette. We drift now into the royal dressing room, a place that was less about style and more about the structural engineering of the human body. If you think modern fashion is uncomfortable, medieval and Renaissance elites were living in a world where a dress could weigh 50 pounds and a collar could literally prevent you from seeing your own feet. For the nobility, Fashion was a form of physical penance, a slow-motion sacrifice at the altar of looking better than the person next to you. Take, for example, the farthingale. This was a structure of wood, wire, or even whalebone worn under the skirt to give it a specific shape. In the Spanish court, they favored the bell shape, which made the wearer look like a very expensive, very stationary pyramid. But then came the French wheel farthingale, which looked exactly like someone had stuck a hula hoop around the queen's waist and draped fabric over it. It was so wide that women couldn't walk through standard doorways. They had to turn sideways, like a crab in silk, just to enter a room. It's the ultimate expression of royal arrogance, expecting the architecture of a palace to accommodate your choice of underwear. And let's float over to the ruff. This was the starched, pleated collar that became the hallmark of the late 16th century. It started as a modest bit of lace, but grew into a monstrous dinner plate-sized disc that kept the head in a permanent, stiff isolation from the rest of the body. To keep these things upright, they used starch, which was a relatively new and magical invention. But starch is made of grain, and during famines, the sight of a nobleman wearing a year's supply of bread around his neck wasn't exactly a great look for the monarchy. The ruff meant you couldn't look down, you couldn't eat easily, and you certainly couldn't be spontaneous. It forced a slow, measured, and incredibly haughty way of moving. If you wanted to see who was talking to you, you had to rotate your entire torso like a turret. Then there were the chopins. These were platform shoes worn primarily by women in Venice and later across European courts. Some of these shoes were 20 inches high. 20 inches! A woman wearing chopins couldn't walk alone. She had to be physically supported by 2 servants, one on each side, just to move from the bed to the table. It was a fashion that
Literally crippled you. But that was the point. It showed that you were so wealthy, so high status, that you didn't need to be able to walk. You were a living statue, a decorative object that required a team of people just to navigate a hallway. In the Spanish court, the obsession with a flat silhouette led to even more drastic measures. Young girls had lead plates strapped to their chests to prevent the development of, well, anything that might ruin the straight line of a bodice. It was a world that viewed the natural human form as a suggestion, something to be crushed, padded, and wired into a shape that reflected the rigid hierarchy of the state. Even the men weren't safe. The codpiece became an increasingly absurd focal point of masculine fashion, growing to such sizes that it had to be padded with cotton or even used as a pocket for handkerchiefs and sweets. Imagine reaching into your decorative groin padding to offer a guest a piece of candied ginger. It was a world of aggressive, weirdly placed displays of virility that often made sitting down a complex logistical challenge. It's a strange, slow existence where your clothes are your cage, a world where the nobility spent hours every morning being sewn into garments they couldn't take off without help. It reminds us that for the elite, beauty was a burden, a heavy, starched, and occasionally lead-lined burden that ensured they could never, ever be mistaken for someone who had to work for a living. Chapter 14. The rotting smiles of the divine and the horror of the royal dentist. We drift now into the mouth of the monarchy, a place that was quite literally a site of slow-moving decay hidden behind fans of ivory and silk. In an era where we obsess over the perfect pearly white smile, it is easy to forget that for a medieval or Renaissance royal, a mouth full of blackened, crumbling stumps was actually a sign of immense wealth. Because, as we've touched on before, only the truly elite could afford the substance that was systematically destroying them: sugar. Sugar was the white gold of the age, a luxury item that was sprinkled on everything from meat to wine. And because the concept of a toothbrush was still several centuries away, the result was a dental catastrophe of imperial proportions. Queen Elizabeth I is perhaps the most famous victim of this sweet sabotage.
By her later years, her addiction to sugar, specifically in the form of marchpane or marzipan, had left her with teeth so dark and rotted they were described by a visiting envoy as looking like black ebony. But the tragedy wasn't just in the look, it was in the relentless, throbbing pain. Imagine being a queen, responsible for the fate of a nation, while a literal abscess is pulsating in your jaw. To mask the smell of rotting teeth, courtiers would pack their mouths with sweet-smelling herbs or constantly chew on cloves, creating a scent that was a mix of a spice shop and a graveyard. When the pain became truly unbearable, the physicians would step in. And in the 16th century, dentistry was less of a medical profession and more of a branch of the local blacksmith's trade. The primary tool for a royal toothache was the pelican, or the dental key, a terrifying iron contraption designed to hook around a tooth and lever it out by brute force. There was no anesthesia, of course, just a stiff drink of ale and perhaps a prayer to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches. Queen Elizabeth was so terrified of the dental key that she refused to have a particularly troublesome tooth pulled for weeks, despite being in agony. It was only when an elderly bishop offered to have one of his own healthy teeth pulled in front of her, just to show her it was survivable, that she finally relented. It's a quiet, pathetic image, the most powerful woman in the world, surrounded by her council, watching an old man bleed just to find the courage to face a pair of pliers. Let's float over to the French court, where Louis XIV's dental history was even more disastrous. His primary physician believed that teeth were the source of almost all bodily infections, so in his infinite wisdom, he decided to pull all of the Sun King's upper teeth in a single year. During the process, the doctor accidentally broke a large piece of the king's jawbone and tore a hole in the roof of his mouth. For the rest of his life, whenever Louis drank wine, it would occasionally come out of his nose. To sanitize the wound, the doctors cauterized the hole in his palate with a red-hot iron 14 times. It is a testament to the sheer, stubborn endurance of these monarchs that Louis continued to host grand banquets and rule France while his mouth was a scorched landscape of botched surgery. This lack of dental hygiene also led to the fashion of the fan. Fans weren't just for cooling oneself in a crowded ballroom. They were essential tools for hiding a mouth that no longer contained any teeth or a breath that could wilt a lily. It created a courtly culture of veiled communication, where every smile was hidden and every laugh was muffled behind lace. It's a world where the highest status symbol was a substance that rotted you from the inside out, a world where a king's majesty had to survive the smell of his own decay and the barbaric ministrations of doctors who thought a hot iron was the cure for a cavity. It reminds us that for all the gold and velvet, the daily reality of a royal life was often of quiet, throbbing, and inescapable physical misery. Chapter 15. The boredom of the crown and the relentless pursuit of distraction. We drift now into the long, shadowed galleries of the palace, where the greatest enemy of the monarchy wasn't a rival army or a peasant revolt, but the sheer crushing weight of boredom. When you are a royal, your life is an endless loop of ceremony, waiting, and being stared at. There were no books for the longest time, no screens, and certainly no stepping out for a quiet walk alone. To combat the silence of a drafty stone castle, the elite developed hobbies that ranged from the intensely obsessive to the downright bizarre, all in a desperate attempt to make the hours between breakfast and the evening's 10-course feast pass a little faster. Consider the Cabinet of Curiosities, or the Wunderkammer. For a bored prince, the world was a collection of things to be owned and categorized. These rooms were filled with everything from mermaid skeletons, usually a monkey's torso sewn to a fish tail, to preserved two-headed calves and jars of exotic sand. The goal was to create a miniature version of the universe that
You could control. Rudolph II, whom we've met before, was so distracted by his collection of clocks and celestial globes that he famously forgot to sign important treaties. He wasn't being malicious, he was just genuinely more interested in how a mechanical golden swan worked than how a province was being governed. It was a slow retreat from reality into a room full of expensive junk. Then there were the fools and dwarfs, a tradition that is perhaps the most uncomfortable for us to look back on. In the medieval and Renaissance courts, people with physical or mental differences were often collected as if they were living curiosities. A natural fool was someone with a cognitive disability whose innocent or random comments were seen as divinely inspired or just amusingly blunt. They were the only people allowed to tell the king he was being an idiot, mostly because the king didn't take them seriously. They were dressed in bright, clashing colors and kept around to provide a constant background noise of distraction. It was a world where a person's dignity was traded for a warm place to sleep and the role of being a human fidget spinner for a bored monarch. Let's float over to the more physical distractions. Hunting, of course, was the king of royal hobbies. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the adrenaline. But even this was turned into a slow, choreographed ritual. In some courts, the deer were literally driven into a fenced-off area so the king didn't have to go through the indignity of actually finding them. He could just sit on his horse, wait for the animal to be paraded past, and do the final deed. It was a performance of manliness that required almost no actual effort, a way to feel like a warrior while never being more than 5 minutes away from a glass of chilled wine. And we must mention the obsession with masks and tableaux vivants. In the court of James I or Louis XIV, the nobility would spend weeks rehearsing elaborate plays where they would dress up as Greek gods or personifications of virtue and plenty. They would stand perfectly still for hours in heavy costumes, creating living pictures for the king to admire. It was a way to kill time by pretending to be someone else. Someone more exciting, perhaps, than a countess who had spent the last 20 years in the same palace. It was a world of high-stakes dress-up, where a single stumble during a dance could lead to social exile, and where the most important thing you did all year was pretend to be a pomegranate in a parade. There is a quiet sadness in this relentless pursuit of entertainment. A world where people had all the power and wealth imaginable, yet spent their days frantically trying to find something, anything, to keep their minds from the reality of their gilded, stagnant lives. It was a slow, rhythmic dance of distraction, played out in the flickering light of thousands of candles, while the world outside the palace walls moved on without them. Chapter 16: The Velvet Shroud and the Architecture of Royal Grief. We drift now into the quiet, darkened chambers of the royal widow, where the vibrant colors of the court are suddenly and violently replaced by a world of absolute, suffocating black. In the medieval and early modern periods, grief wasn't just a personal emotion, it was a performance of state, a slow-motion theater of loss that governed every single second of a woman's life. When a king died, his queen didn't just lose a husband, she entered a transitional state of social death, where her only job was to be a living monument to the man who was gone. The most extreme version of this was the deuil blanc, or white mourning, practiced by the queens of France. For 40 days after the death of her husband, a queen was expected to remain in a room draped entirely in black, with the windows shuttered against the sun. She stayed in bed, illuminated only by candles, wearing robes of stark, ghostly white. She wasn't allowed to see the light of day or hear the sounds of the bustling palace outside. It was a sensory deprivation tank made of velvet and silk. Imagine the mental state of a woman, already grieving, trapped in a dark room for over a month with nothing to do but contemplate her own sudden loss of power. It's no wonder so many of them emerged from these 40 days looking like they had aged a decade. Let's float over to the long-term etiquette of the royal widow. Once she left her darkened chamber, the rules didn't exactly loosen up. A widow was expected to wear widow's weeds, heavy, scratchy wool or dull silk for years, or even for the rest of her life.
Jewelry was forbidden unless it was mourning jewelry made of jet or containing a lock of the deceased's hair. This created a peculiar industry of macabre fashion. You might see a duchess wearing a brooch that featured a tiny painted skull or a ring with a miniature weeping willow of her husband's chest hair. It was a way of literally wearing your trauma on your sleeve, a constant physical reminder that your better half was now being processed by the royal worms. Consider the ultimate widow of history, Queen Victoria. While she falls a bit later than our medieval focus, she took the medieval tradition of permanent grief and turned it into a national identity. After Albert died in 1861, Victoria wore black for 40 years. She had Albert's clothes laid out every morning, fresh water put in his basin, and his shaving kit prepared, as if he might just pop back into the room at any moment. She turned her entire life into a museum of a dead man. Every palace she stayed in became a shrine. It was a slow, rhythmic, and incredibly heavy way to live, a choice to stay frozen in a single moment of 1861 while the rest of the world moved into the 20th century. Then there was the dowager status. If the new king was her son, the widow might retain some influence, but if he was a nephew or a distant cousin, she was often shunted off to a dower house, a smaller, usually drafty, and significantly less fun palace in the middle of nowhere. She went from being the center of the universe to a polite inconvenience. Many of these women turned to extreme piety or became obsessive letter writers, trying to maintain their relevance from a distance. It was a world where a woman's political expiration date was tied directly to her husband's pulse. There is a quiet, rhythmic sadness to this existence, a world where the rustle of black silk was the only sound in the hallways, and where your entire identity was defined by a tomb in a cathedral you weren't allowed to visit alone. It reminds us that for the women of the court, the happily ever after was often followed by a very long, very quiet, and very dark ever after, lived in the shadow of a crown that no longer belonged to them.
Chapter 17. The Shivering Majesty and the Futile Battle Against the Draft. We drift now into the deep, biting chill of the medieval winter, a season that turned even the most magnificent palace into a literal icebox. It is a common misconception that being a king meant being warm. In reality, the higher your ceilings, the more space there was for the heat to escape, and for the cold, damp air to settle into your bones. To be a royal in January was to live in a state of permanent, dignified shivering, wrapped in layers of fur that probably still smelled faintly of the forest they came from. The primary defense against the cold was, of course, the great fireplace. These were massive stone caverns, large enough to roast an entire ox, but they were remarkably inefficient. Most of the heat went straight up the chimney, while the draft from the poorly fitted windows whistled across the floor. This created a peculiar microclimate where your face might be uncomfortably hot, almost scorched by the blaze, while your back was literally developing frost. To combat this, the nobility sat in high-backed chairs designed to act as heat shields, trapping the warmth of the fire around their bodies and blocking the freezing gusts from the hallway. It was a world of localized warmth, where moving 3 feet to the left could feel like stepping into a different climate zone. Then there were the tapestries. We tend to look at them today as decorative art, but in a medieval castle, they were essential insulation. They were the wallpaper of the elite, hung several inches away from the cold, sweating stone walls to create a pocket of dead air. But this came with its own set of problems. Tapestries were the perfect breeding ground for moths, spiders, and, occasionally, bad air. They also had a tendency to flutter whenever someone opened a door, creating an eerie, ghostly movement in the room that did very little for the nerves of an already paranoid monarch. Let's float over to the bed curtains, which were perhaps the most important architectural feature of a royal bedroom. A medieval bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a room within a room. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight at night to trap the body heat of the sleepers, and, as we've discussed, there were often several of them. Inside that small, dark space, the air would become thick and warm, a tiny sanctuary against the freezing void of the rest of the bedchamber. When the king had to step out of bed in the morning, the transition was so brutal that it's no wonder the levee involved so many people handing him warm shirts and heated stones. For the more mobile forms of warmth, the royals relied on hand warmers, hollow metal spheres filled with hot coals that you could carry in your sleeves. And of course, there were the dogs. We've mentioned the King Charles Spaniels, but one of their primary functions was to act as living, breathing heating pads. Having 3 or 4 small dogs sleeping on your feet or tucked into your robes wasn't just a sign of affection, it was a survival strategy. It was a world where a lapdog had a very literal, very practical job description. Consider the winter of 1709, the Great Frost of Europe. It was so cold that the bells in the church towers allegedly cracked when they were rung. In the Palace of Versailles, the wine froze in the king's glass at the dinner table. Imagine being Louis XIV, the most powerful man in the world, sitting in a hall of mirrors while your vintage Bordeaux turns into a popsicle in front of your eyes. The courtiers were so cold they had to wear their heavy outdoor cloaks during chapel services, and the breath of the praying monks created a fog so thick they could barely see the altar. It was a moment where the illusion of royal power over nature completely shattered, replaced by the simple, desperate need for another log on the fire. There is a quiet, rhythmic irony in this struggle. A world where you could own provinces and command armies, yet be defeated by a drafty window or a cold floor. It reminds us that the life of the elite was a constant, exhausting battle against the elements, a slow-moving existence lived in the flicker of a fire that never quite reached the corners of the room. Chapter 18: The Lethal Leisure of the Elite and the Games of Sudden Departure. We drift now onto the tournament grounds and the polished tennis courts of the palace, where royal recreation was often just a very fancy way of flirting with the afterlife. In a world where a king was expected to be a warrior, his hobbies couldn't just be needlepoint or chess, though they did plenty of that when the gout flared up. To maintain the majesty of the crown, a monarch had to engage in activities that were physically demanding, highly public, and occasionally accidentally fatal. It's a bit of a recurring theme. The more important the person, the more likely they were to die while trying to have a bit of fun. Take, for instance, the sport of kings, the joust. This was the ultimate medieval spectacle, a high-speed collision involving 2 men, 2 horses, and 2 very long pieces of splintering wood. It was supposed to be a demonstration of skill, but by the mid-16th century it had become a bit of a demographic problem for the French monarchy. In 1559, King Henry II of France decided to celebrate a peace treaty by jousting against the captain of his own guard. It was all very festive until a splinter from the captain's lance pierced King Henry's visor and entered his eye, eventually reaching his brain. Henry spent 10 agonizing days dying, while his surgeons, including the famous Ambrose Parr, tried to replicate the wound on the heads of 4 condemned criminals to see if they could find a cure. They couldn't, and Henry's death plunged France into decades of religious civil war. It was perhaps the most expensive celebration in history. Let's float over to the surprisingly dangerous world of real tennis. Long before the quiet lawns of Wimbledon, tennis was played in indoor stone courts with heavy, solid balls made of leather and hair. It was a frantic, sweaty game that kings like Henry VIII and Charles VIII of France absolutely adored. However, the game had a habit of ending poorly. Charles VIII, for example, was walking to the tennis courts at the Château d'Ambeau when he hit his head on a low stone lintel. Being a king, he didn't stop to seek medical attention. He went ahead and watched the match, only to collapse and die a few hours later. It's a very humble end for a man who had invaded Italy, defeated not by a rival army, but by a doorframe on his way to a game. Then there was the obsession with the hunt, which we've mentioned as a social event, but it was also a prime location for unfortunate accidents. In a world where your younger brother or distant cousin stands to inherit your crown, a hunting party could quickly become a really cold family reunion. It happened more often than you'd think. Consider the case of William Rufus, son of William the Conqueror of England. He was killed while hunting in the New Forest in 1100. A stag had been flushed from the bushes, and a nobleman, Walter Tyrrell, aimed a crossbow at it, but the arrow accidentally hit the king instead. The official verdict was misadventure, but it came at a very convenient time for William's brother, Henry, who seemed to be prepared to take the crown immediately after the accident.
An ambitious cousin stood to inherit everything if you happened to have a mishap. A forest full of armed men and galloping horses was a very dangerous place to be. King William II of England, known as William Rufus, was out hunting in the New Forest when he was struck by an arrow fired by one of his own nobles. Was it a stray shot? Was it a calculated assassination? We'll never know for sure, but the noble in question immediately fled to France, and William's brother, Henry, rode straight to the treasury to secure the crown. It's the kind of convenience that makes you wonder if accident was just the medieval word for promotion. Even the safer games like football, which in the Middle Ages was essentially a sanctioned riot between two villages, were seen as a threat to the state. Not because the king might get hurt, but because the commoners were spending too much time kicking a pig's bladder and not enough time practicing their archery. Multiple kings actually banned football because it was unproductive and led to too many broken limbs. They wanted their peasants healthy and ready for war, not limping because of a disputed goal. There was a quiet, rhythmic irony in these royal pastimes, a world where the most guarded people on earth would voluntarily put themselves in positions of extreme physical danger just to prove they weren't bored. It reminds us that for the elite, leisure was a performance, a way to demonstrate courage and vigor even when the game was rigged or the risks were absurdly high. It was a slow, dangerous dance of ego and adrenaline, played out on the grass and the stone, while the crown sat precariously on a head that might not survive the afternoon. Chapter 19. The Iron Shackle of Etiquette and the Fatal Blushes of the Court. We drift now into the suffocating atmosphere of the royal presence chamber, where every movement, every cough, and every glance was governed by a set of rules so rigid they could practically stand up on their own. In the courts of Europe, and most notably in the Spanish and French courts, etiquette wasn't just about being polite, it was a weaponized form of social control. To break a rule of etiquette was more than a faux pas. It was a personal insult to the monarch, a crack in the divine order, and for some, a source of such profound shame that it was literally impossible to survive it. Consider the Spanish court, which was perhaps the most joyless place in Christendom. There was a rule for everything. The king's etiquette dictated exactly how many steps he could take across a room before he had to be greeted, and who, precisely, was allowed to touch his right arm versus his left. In one famous, though possibly apocryphal story, a queen of Spain fell from her horse, her foot caught in the stirrup. She was being dragged to her death, but the grandees of the court stood frozen. Why? Because it was a capital offense to touch the queen's foot. Two brave soldiers finally stepped in and saved her life, and then immediately fled the country, knowing that the king might have to execute them for the crime of saving his wife's life in an unauthorized manner. When your life depends on someone following a rule about ankles, you know the system has perhaps gone a bit too far. Then there's the tragic case of François Wattel, the master of ceremonies for the Prince of Condé. In 1671, the prince was hosting Louis XIV for a 3-day festival that was meant to be the social event of the decade.
The pressure on Watteau was immense. On the second night, the fireworks were obscured by fog. Watteau was devastated. On the third morning, the delivery of fresh fish for the king's dinner was late. Only 2 crates arrived. Watteau, a man whose entire soul was woven into the perfection of royal service, couldn't handle the perceived failure. He reportedly walked to his room, propped his sword against the door, and ran himself through. He died for a lack of sea bass. The irony, of course, is that the fish arrived just moments after his body was found. The king ate well, but the man who had orchestrated the perfection was gone, a victim of the crushing weight of courtly expectation. Let's float over to the gaze. In many courts, it was considered a grave insult to look the king directly in the eye. You had to keep your gaze lowered, acknowledging your status as a mere mortal in the presence of a sun god. This meant that the court was filled with people perpetually staring at the floor or the king's shoes. Imagine trying to navigate a crowded ballroom when everyone is looking at their own toes to avoid accidental treason. It created a strange, tilted world where the only person allowed to look up was the only person who was probably too bored to care. Even the act of sitting down was a battlefield of status. At the French court, only certain high-ranking ladies were allowed the tabouret, a simple backless stool. Everyone else had to stand for hours. During a royal wedding or a long play, duchesses would be on the verge of fainting, their legs trembling, all for the privilege of standing in the same room as the king. To sit without permission was to invite social death. It was a world where physical comfort was traded for the tiny symbolic victory of being allowed to rest your backside on a bit of padded wood for 20 minutes. There is a quiet, rhythmic cruelty to this world, a place where a misplaced fork or an accidental glance could ruin a family's fortunes for generations. It reminds us that the life of a courtier was a constant, exhausting performance, a slow-motion walk on a tightrope where the safety net was made of gossamer and the audience was waiting for you to trip. It was a world of velvet and lace that felt as heavy as lead, where the most important thing wasn't who you were, but exactly how many inches you bowed when the king walked past. Chapter 20. The Gilded Leash and the Tragic Privilege of the Royal Beast. We drift now back into the private chambers, where the heavy scent of incense and old stone is broken by the sharp yapping of a creature that has no idea it's living in a palace. If being a royal child was a genetic and social gamble, being a royal pet was an exercise in bizarre, over-the-top indulgence that often ended in a very confusing form of tragedy. In a world where a peasant might not see a piece of meat for a month, the king's favorite hound was often dining on poached capon, served on a silver platter. But as we've seen with their masters, the best care of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance was frequently a one-way ticket to a very pampered grave. Consider the comfort dogs of the Renaissance. These weren't just pets, they were medical devices. Because doctors believed that diseases were caused by an imbalance of heat, it was
Thought that a small, warm dog pressed against the stomach could draw out the pains of a cold or the cramps of a royal lady. This meant these dogs spent their lives as living hot water bottles, moved from one aching royal belly to the next. While it sounds cozy, the dogs often suffered from the same sedentary, overfed lifestyle as the nobility. We have records of royal lapdogs so fat they had to be carried on cushions because their tiny legs could no longer support the weight of all those treats from the high table. They were essentially furry, breathing sausages in silk collars. Then there were the exotic gifts that arrived in the royal menageries, which we touched on before, but the personal stories are even more heartbreaking. Take the Hanno the elephant, a gift to Pope Leo X in 1514. Hanno was the Pope's absolute favorite. He was taught to bow, to dance, and to squirt water at courtiers, which, let's be honest, is probably something every pope secretly wants to do.
But when Hanno became constipated, the Vatican doctors applied their usual more is better logic. They decided the best cure for an elephant was a massive suppository enriched with gold. Unsurprisingly, the gold did not fix the elephant, it poisoned him. Hanno died in the Pope's arms, and the mourning was so intense that the great artist Raphael was commissioned to paint a life-size memorial on the palace wall. It's a classic historical irony. A creature that survived a trek across the Alps and the Mediterranean was eventually taken down by a prestigious laxative. Let's float over to the court of Marie Antoinette, where the obsession with dogs reached a peak of expensive absurdity. She was particularly fond of her spaniels and her pug, Mops. When she left Austria to marry the future Louis XVI, she was forced to leave all her Austrian possessions behind at the border, including her beloved dog. It was a symbolic cleansing of her old identity. However, she eventually got her dogs back, and they lived in a world of pure silk. Her dogs had their own rooms in Versailles, their own specialized attendants, and even their own miniature sofas that matched the Queen's decor. But when the revolution came, the dogs didn't understand the change in the wind. There are stories of the Queen's dogs being found wandering the empty, ransacked halls of the Tuileries, looking for a hand to feed them a macaron that would never come. And we cannot forget the monkeys of the bedchamber. Monkeys were incredibly popular because they could be dressed up to mimic the courtiers. They wore tiny ruffs, tiny swords, and even tiny versions of the royal crown. But monkeys are, by nature, agents of chaos. They would swing from the priceless tapestries, steal the king's spectacles, and occasionally bite the hand that fed them. When a royal monkey died, it wasn't just a pet passing, it was a state event. They were often buried in small, ornate coffins with miniature headstones, sometimes with more sincere tears shed over them than over a distant royal cousin who had died the same week. There is a quiet, rhythmic sadness to these animals. They were plucked from their natural worlds to live in a drafty, perfumed cage of human making. They were overfed, overperfumed, and frequently subjected to the same lethal medical theories that were killing the kings. It reminds us that in the royal court, even the animals were props in a grand, slow-moving play, living symbols of a monarch's power to command the wild, even if they couldn't command their own digestion. Chapter 21: The Heavy Lids of State and the Nightmares of the Crown. We drift now into the deepest, darkest hours of the royal night, a time when the gold and velvet lost their luster, and the monarch was left with nothing but a flickering candle and the silence of a stone vault. Sleep, for a medieval or Renaissance ruler, was never a simple matter of closing one's eyes. It was a logistical operation, a spiritual battle, and a constant struggle against the physical reality of a world that was trying to kill you. When we think of a royal bed, we think of luxury, but for the person lying in it, that bed was often a place of intense, quiet anxiety. First, we must consider the two sleeps. Before the Industrial Revolution and the invention of artificial light, humans usually didn't sleep in one 8-hour block. Instead, they had first sleep, followed by an hour or two of wakefulness in the middle of the night, a time for prayer, reading, or hushed conversation, and then a second sleep. For a king, this middle-of-the-night waking period was when the demons of statecraft really came out to play. Imagine lying in a massive 4-poster bed, the curtains drawn tight to keep out the drafts, listening to the wind howl through the battlements, and wondering if your youngest son is currently plotting with the King of France. It was a slow, rhythmic psychological toll that no amount of feather padding could soften. Then there was the physical discomfort of the bed itself. While the frames were magnificent, the mattresses were often stuffed with straw, or if you were lucky, down feathers that tended to clump and harbor a miniature ecosystem of bedbugs and lice. Even the Sun King, Louis XIV, spent his nights being bitten by insects that didn't care about his divine right to rule. To combat the bad humors of the night, royals often slept propped up by dozens of pillows. They didn't lie flat, they slept almost sitting up, because it was believed that lying flat would allow the humors to flow to the brain and cause madness or sudden death. It's a wonder they didn't all wake up with permanent neck cramps. Let's float over to the watch. A king never truly slept alone. Outside the heavy bed curtains there were always guards, and inside the room there were often grooms of the chamber sleeping on small pallets. This wasn't just for protection against assassins, it was for the king's peace of mind. But imagine the lack of privacy. Every snore, every restless toss and turn, and every nightmare-induced mumble was overheard by a servant whose job was to record the king's health. If the king had a bad dream, it might be discussed by the Privy Council the next morning as a potential omen. Your subconscious wasn't even your own. It was state property. And what did they dream about? The journals of monarchs are filled with melancholy visions. They dreamed of their crowns falling into the sea, of their ancestors rising from their tombs to scold them, or of being chased by lions. Because their waking lives were so controlled and rigid, their dreams were often chaotic and terrifying. They used dream books to interpret these visions, turning a simple case of indigestion from too much venison into a prophecy of a coming plague. It was a world where even the quietest moment of the night was heavy with the weight of symbolic meaning.
There is a quiet, rhythmic irony in the royal sleep. A world where you could own 100 palaces, yet never find a single night of truly restful, private slumber. It reminds us that for the elite, the crown was a burden that stayed on the head even when it was resting on a pillow. It was a slow, dark journey through the night, lived in the shadow of a flickering wick, while the rest of the world slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of those who had nothing to lose. Chapter 22. The Spare and the Scare, the toxic rivalry of the bloodline. We drift now into the nursery-turned-war room, where the heir and the spare lived in a state of mutual, velvet-lined suspicion. In the modern world, sibling rivalry might involve a stolen sweater or a heated argument over the remote. In the world of the absolute monarch, sibling rivalry involved raising an army in the middle of the night and locking your brother in a damp tower for 30 years. To be the second son of a king was to be a living backup plan, a human just in case who spent their life waiting for a tragedy that would make them relevant. The problem with the spare was that they were given the same education, the same pride, and the same sense of divine entitlement as the heir, but with absolutely none of the responsibility. This created a specific type of royal boredom that was incredibly dangerous. With no throne to sit on and plenty of money to spend, the younger brothers often became the center of courtly intrigue. If you were a disgruntled nobleman who hated the king, you didn't look for a peasant to lead a revolt. You went to the king's brother and whispered, "You know, that crown would look much better on a head like yours." Take the case of Gaston, Duke of Orleans, the younger brother of Louis XIII. Gaston made a professional career out of being a nuisance. He spent decades conspiring against his brother and the powerful Cardinal Richelieu. He led rebellions, fled the country, and constantly plotted to seize power. But because he was of the blood royal, he could never be executed like a common traitor. Every time he failed, he would eventually be welcomed back to court with a shrug and a "don't do it again, Gaston." It was a cycle of high-stakes sibling annoyance that kept the entire French government in a state of permanent anxiety. Let's float over to the Ottoman Empire, where they developed a much more efficient and significantly more gruesome solution to the sibling problem.
For a long period, it was traditional for a new sultan to execute all his brothers upon his accession to prevent civil war. In 1595, Mehmed III had 19 of his brothers strangled with silk bowstrings in a single night. It was a brutal, rhythmic logic. The peace of the empire was worth more than the lives of a few spare princes. Eventually, this was replaced by the coffice, or the cage, a luxury apartment within the palace where princes were kept in total isolation for their entire lives, just in case they were needed as a replacement. Imagine being 25 years old and having never spoken to anyone but a few silent servants, only to be suddenly dragged out and told you were now the ruler of the world. It's no wonder many of these sultans emerged from the cage with a few eccentricities. Even in the less murderous courts, the spare was a constant source of the scare. If the king was sickly or hadn't produced an heir, the younger brother was a walking reminder of the king's own mortality. They were the shadow in the corner of every banquet, the person the courtiers were secretly bowing to just a little bit lower, just in case the wind changed. This created a world where brothers could rarely be friends. To trust your sibling was to leave your back exposed to the person most motivated to see you gone. There is a quiet, rhythmic tragedy in this bloodline, a world where the people who should have been your closest allies were your most natural enemies. It reminds us that for the elite, family wasn't a source of comfort. It was a game of musical chairs with crowns and daggers. It was a slow, suspicious walk through the palace halls, where every good morning from a brother carried the unspoken weight of a "Why aren't you dead yet?" Chapter 23. The King's Remainder, the Morbid Economy of Royal Body Parts. We drift now into the flickering candlelight of the reliquary, where the boundary between a monarch and a saint becomes uncomfortably blurred. In the medieval mind, the divinity of a king didn't necessarily evaporate when his pulse stopped. If a king was the Lord's anointed, then his physical remains, his hair, his nail clippings, and especially his heart, carried a residue of that sacred power. This led to a strange, slow-motion scavenged economy where the parts of a dead monarch were traded, stolen, and enshrined like holy relics. To own a piece of a king was to own a piece of history, and more importantly, a piece of political legitimacy. When a royal tomb was opened, which happened with surprising frequency during renovations or revolutions, it wasn't just a moment of mourning, it was a souvenir hunt. When the tomb of Edward I was opened in 1774, the observers were so struck by his well-preserved state that they reportedly reached in to touch his skin. One gentleman even tried to snip off a lock of the Hammer of the Scots' hair. It was a world where the royal body was never truly allowed to rest. It was a resource to be mined. The most coveted organ was, of course, the heart. As we've seen, a heart was often buried separately from the body, but its journey didn't always end in the designated abbey. Take the heart of Louis XIV. In the French Revolution, the royal tombs were ransacked and the hearts were tossed aside. Louis XIV's heart allegedly ended up in the hands of an English nobleman, Lord Harcourt, who showed it off at dinner parties. As the story goes, the geologist William Buckland, upon being shown the mummified walnut-like object, exclaimed, "I have eaten many strange things, but never the heart of a king," and promptly swallowed it. Whether he was a gourmet or a madman, it highlights a terrifying truth. The Sun King survived the Fronde and the Dutch War, only to be digested by a Victorian scientist. Then there was the Hand of Glory phenomenon. In some darker corners of folklore and royal superstition, the hand of a deceased monarch or a high-ranking noble was believed to have magical properties. If you could get your hands on a royal hand, you could allegedly unlock any door or cast asleep on an entire household. While mostly the stuff of Gothic novels, the actual theft of royal fingers and hands was a real concern. When Charles I was executed, people rushed the scaffold, not just to dip their handkerchiefs in his blood, a relic thought to cure the king's evil, but to try and snatch any small piece of him they could.
Let's float over to the king's touch. This was the belief that a reigning monarch could cure scrofula, a skin disease, simply by touching the sufferer. This royal virtue was so potent that even after a king died, the objects he had touched, medals, coins, or scraps of his clothing, were treated as talismans. Monarchs like Charles II touched nearly 100,000 people during their reigns. It was a massive, sweaty, and highly infectious PR campaign that reinforced the idea that the royal body was fundamentally different from a human one. It was a body of grace, and even a splinter of his coffin was worth more than a peasant's life. There is a quiet, rhythmic horror in this obsession. A world where a king's bones were moved like chess pieces across Europe to settle diplomatic debts or sanctify new cathedrals. It reminds us that for the elite, there was no such thing as ashes to ashes. They were too valuable to be dust. They had to be gold-plated, jarred, and occasionally accidentally eaten. It was the final, most gruesome price of power, the realization that even in death, your body was not your own, but a collection of sacred curiosities for a world that refused to let you go. Chapter 24: The Golden Font and the Perils of the Royal Baptism. We drift now into the echoing, incense-filled transept of the royal chapel, where a tiny, shrieking infant is about to become the center of a geopolitical earthquake. In the medieval and Renaissance world, a royal baptism wasn't just a religious sacrament. It was a high-stakes theatrical production designed to prove the legitimacy of the heir and the bottomless coffers of the crown. It was the child's first public appearance, and if the court had its way, it was also the most uncomfortable day of their very short life. The primary hazard was the great font. To ensure the child was properly welcomed into the faith, they weren't just sprinkled with a bit of water. They were often fully immersed in a basin made of solid gold or silver, large enough to bathe a small dog. Because these ceremonies were massive public events, they could last for hours. The water, blessed and holy as it was, tended to lose its temperature quickly in the drafty cathedrals. There are numerous accounts of royal infants turning an alarming shade of Plantagenet blue, while a bishop droned on in Latin over their shivering naked bodies. Then there was the procession of the salt. In many traditions, a piece of salt was placed in the infant's mouth to symbolize wisdom and preservation. Imagine a newborn being fed a literal rock of salt while already screaming in a freezing cathedral. This was usually followed by the chrism, an anointing with thick, perfumed oils that were applied so liberally the child became as slippery as a wet seal. More than one clumsy godfather, trembling under the weight of his heavy ceremonial robes and the gaze of 1,000 courtiers, nearly fumbled the future of the dynasty onto the cold marble. Let's float over to the godparents. Choosing a godparent was a diplomatic minefield. You didn't pick your best friend. You picked the King of Spain or the Holy Roman Emperor. These powerful figures often didn't show up in person. They sent proxies, but they sent gifts that were meant to intimidate. We're talking about solid gold cradles, life-sized silver statues of saints, and chests of jewels. For the child, these were useless. For the state, it was a way of saying, "We are so rich, we can afford to give a baby a mountain of gold before he can even hold his own head up." The scale of the celebration was equally exhausting. When the future Edward VI was baptized, the procession involved 80 noblemen carrying silver bowls of spices and wine, and the ceremony didn't even start until midnight. The poor infant was paraded through the dark, cold palace, surrounded by flickering torches and hundreds of shouting people.
It was a sensory assault that frequently led to the child falling ill immediately afterward. It is a strange, rhythmic irony that the very ceremony meant to ensure the child's spiritual eternal life often put their physical life in immediate jeopardy. And what of the names? A royal name was a heavy thing. You weren't just Bob, you were Charles, James, Louis, Augustus. Every name was a nod to a powerful ancestor or a claim to a disputed territory. By the time the herald finished announcing the baby's full title, the child had usually given up on crying and moved on to a state of shocked silence. It was a world where the nursery met the altar in a clash of velvet and holy water. A world where a baby was treated like a sacred relic before they had even been weaned, and the first step towards the throne was surviving a 3-hour ritual in a room that was 10 degrees below freezing. It reminds us that for the elite, childhood didn't exist. There was only the long, slow, and often very damp preparation for the crown. Chapter 25. The Tutors of Titans and the Crushing Weight of the Royal Alphabet. We drift now into the quiet, sun-streaked library of the palace, where the air smells of old vellum, fresh ink, and the palpable anxiety of a man whose job is to turn a spoiled toddler into a sun king. Royal education was a bizarre experiment in human development. The goal was to produce a being who was simultaneously a master of Latin, a strategic genius, a graceful dancer, and a divinely appointed philosopher. In reality, it usually produced a child who was overworked, socially isolated, and deeply resentful of the letter Q. The primary struggle for a royal tutor was the paradox of the pupil. How do you discipline a child who technically outranks you? As we've seen, the whipping boy was the physical solution, but the mental solution was a grueling schedule that would make a modern PhD candidate weep. A prince was often woken at dawn to begin lessons in Greek and Latin, followed by hours of theology, history, and prince's law. There was no playtime in the sense we understand it. Even a game of cards was turned into a lesson on mathematical probability or the nuances of courtly deception.